Rob, good morning.
Morning.
We've had an interesting journey this last few months since we met.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think it must be, is it about 4 months now? I think when I first met you.
It seems like I turned up to do a talk at a business networking group, and I didn't really know what to talk about until I had a quick green tea or coffee, was it, with you beforehand?
Yeah, I hadn't anticipated. I think it was strange with networking events. I generally don't like them, but because I can be quite an anxious person, and walking into a room full of people to network with gets my haunches up. The thought of me giving a lanyard and having to make conversation terrifies me. But then obviously I met you on the table, and it kind of changed my life.
Well, I mean, you made clear to me that the topic I had to share with people that morning was about how anxiety can be transformed. Because so many people go through life not knowing there is a solution. They've tried everything and nothing's worked. But you really highlighted it for me. So I can't remember what you said to me at that table, but you give me some clue that anxiety was something that was holding you back. You're clearly hugely effective. You're high performing. But underneath, it's like the duck sailing across the surface. Underneath is a huge amount of wild paddling going on. Was that you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I was masking how I was truly feeling. And I've had like you said, fairly successful in many ways. I had a very happy family life, a successful business and so on, but always on the edge of something quite, a feeling of fear and anxiety that it could all be taken away at a moment, and not really understanding. Well, I knew, we'll get into it. There's a big life event that I think stimulated it. In fact, it goes far deeper than that.
Yeah.
I felt that was always on the cusp of some sort of fear.
So when we go through life, we meet all sorts of people in all sorts of scenarios and situations. And it's only when you scratch the surface that you suddenly realize that often the external persona that people have is very different to how they're feeling themselves. They go through life almost feeling like imposters, that they're calm, but underneath they're scared, they're frightened, they're hypervigilant.
Yeah.
And so was that you?
Yeah, definitely. I always put it down to my GCSE in drama got me through life to a point, because I could be a version of myself when I needed it to be. I was able to be, in the certain environments I could be Rob the this or Rob the that, but actually there was quite a lot of acting going on. There was quite an anxious, insecure person behind that shell that I kind of put out.
Yeah, and the people I meet, sometimes they're elite athletes, sometimes they're very successful business people, sometimes they're in the acting or music profession. And very often the persona that we've been given to believe is them is totally different to what they're feeling about themselves. And I guess that's because we all need coping strategies if we are riddled with anxiety.
Yeah, I think I'd never really dealt with it. We can go into where it all kind of really came from, the big life-changing moment, but I'd never truly dealt with it. And I think that's the problem with when you have a life-changing event, is that you're not really supported afterwards.
Yeah.
In my instance, I'll go into it if you like, my exact scenario. So I was actually in London doing some work I do lots of campaigning for like charities. This was a carbon monoxide awareness charity, and I'd been filming with ITV over at their Millbank studios, and then I was just gleefully was walking and talking to the PR agency we're with as we walked over to our hotel, which was the other side of Westminster Bridge, just chatting. Next thing you know, that I heard what I thought was a car crash, somebody screaming, jump. Next thing I know, there's a 4x4 gunning down the pavement, knocking people side to side. One chap actually went over my head. And I found myself in the centre of the Westminster Bridge terror attack. And it was just from being completely serenely walking along to being in the centre of what felt like a movie scene. And it was horrific to the point where when I was looking back, I was actually a guest. I was a part of the inquest because I was so central to it. And then you see the camera footage back, and you're talking 4 inches. You can see the bonnet of the car and me. And then, and you see the lady that was stood 6 foot in front of me who tragically died. And that's how close I was to death. And that is a life-changing moment. And the work from that, and I remember the feeling like the world had just slowed down.
Yeah.
Like I felt like it as an out-of-body experience.
Yeah.
Like this isn't real life. There's ambulances and helicopters and chaos all around. And because I was media trained, because I'd been doing media work in London, next thing I know, first of all, it was the producers of ITV phoning everyone to check they're okay. I know you're in the area. Are you okay? When they realised, yes, I'm okay to a point, but in amongst it, they suddenly, in hindsight, took advantage of, I've got a media trained witness. Would you mind being on the news? And before you know it, I'm stood and I must have done 10, 15 rounds of international TV interviews with, TV channels in America, Channel 4 News, ITV. And I think that would have only heightened the damage. I was still in a position of just utter fear.
Did anybody ask how you were?
No. Well, apart from the initial, are you okay? Yes.
Yeah, but they're asking you, but they're physically. Are you physically okay?
Yeah,
but did anybody ask how are you emotionally? How are you mentally?
No, not at all. And I remember that. Yeah, because my biggest concern at the time was I need to get in touch with my wife. Yeah, tell her I'm okay. Because she was having her friends were WhatsApping her like crazy, saying, "I've seen Rob on TV. I hope he's okay." But she knew I should have been on TV that day because I was meant to be doing TV interviews. She was like, "Yeah, I know. Yeah, I know he's in London." And then when they came and more pretended, then she couldn't get in touch with me because I'd actually taken off my coat and there was a lady that was injured. I gave it to her like as under her head, and I left my phone was in that pocket. And at this point, I'd been swept off into a police van. And then she couldn't get hold of me. And then obviously, as you can imagine, the anxiety just went up and up and up and up and up.
Oh, wow.
And to the point where I don't know why or how I did it. I still then carried on with the TV interviews I was meant to do on carbon monoxide the following day. Because I kind of thought I've come all this way.
It's kind of
I'm here for a cause to help people. I can't just then run off home. And then from that point, then there was an inquest and, it's all massively traumatic. But apart from, a phone number for a police support helpline, you're kind of just left.
And your experience there is no different to what I hear from war veterans or from the police service themselves. I've been talking to a number of policemen recently, and police women too. They face these traumas all day, every day.
Absolutely.
And do you imagine what they face? It might not be happening to them, but they're helping other people sort out real major catastrophes. You've probably had that one experience, that depth of trauma once in your life. Often the police force or the military, they're dealing with that all day, every day. And yet they too are often not left with adequate, effective interventions to help them cope. So you called it trauma, but a lot of us go through life with pretty high impact experiences that impact us mentally. We don't always call them traumas, but you did in this case, did you?
Yeah. It felt, this is maybe it's a term I now think of more now that I know, I've been part of, the Zing Programme. I'm now, I recognize it now for what it was. At the time, it was just a life event that was horrific, but then you still, life just carries on and you sort of park it in a bit of your brain and you hope it'll just all go away.
So you were given a phone number saying, ring this number if you want. Did you actually ring it?
No.
Did anybody else offer you help?
No. I think the police bit was strange because I felt quite used when I was finishing that process. They needed a witness for an inquest, and I was told to get from A to B. But then when I left, it was actually at the Old Bailey. It was there's a video of me coming out the courtroom. Because, at that time it was still very very much big news, and getting chased up the street by a journalist trying to get a comment. But as soon as I walked out of the Old Bailey, it was as if they washed their hands of me to a degree that you would think someone that's then just revisited a massive trauma again in real detail. Maybe there'd be a cup of tea after as a minimum, but no, nothing. You're finished now. Okay, thank you.
And you had to go back to work the next day as if nothing had happened.
Yeah, still the kids still needed bathing when I got home. Still had work to do the following day. You just have to carry on.
How long was it before you started thinking, has that had a profound impact on my mental state?
It presented itself quite quickly. My biggest piece was the world was just in slow motion for a long time. Certainly because I think because it was a vehicle. I remember whenever I was in the car, anxiety of the rearview mirror, because I was just, I could spot it was a Hyundai 4x4 that was, and I could spot a Hyundai badge at sort of 100 meters. Yeah. I still see it now slightly.
They call that hypervigilance.
Yeah, and I would feel like I'm driving in slow motion. Getting from A to B and parking was suddenly something I would have done just automatically.
Well, when you have traumas like that, it sets up what in effect is an amplifier in your brain, and all of your senses are looking for anything similar to what you experienced when you had that traumatic experience. So if what you see, what you hear, smell, taste, or touch is similar to what your brain was experiencing at the time, it turns on this amplifier and you become hypervigilant. And in the extreme, it'll put you into a panic attack or create a phobia or whatever. But you're not going to be the same. Everything is going to be distorted for a while, and your brain floods with cortisol. All sorts of things happen. It's preparing you for fight or flight. And when that happens, your brain can't operate in the normal way, because the brain is commandeered to make everything focus on your survival.
Yeah, and that's exactly what you're describing. Exactly how I felt. It was like I said, it was sound was the big one. Visual for me, it's very visual and sound based. I can't think of any sort of smells on the day that would send me back there. But if a bus was to drive over a manhole cover with any sort of bang, I would, over revving engine, because I remember at the time, I guess the guy was probably only in second gear, but flooring it. And this if I hear one of my neighbours has got a motorbike and he's not even, much better now, but he used to like, maybe what you do on motorbikes before you get going, you rev it up to get it started. Yeah. And that sound would wake me up, and I would be hairs on my neck, I'd be sweating, and it just took me instantly back there.
And it gives floods of cortisol in different parts of your brain. So you are effectively mentally out of action for quite some time.
Yeah.
Sometimes it can be hours, depends how serious it is. But spells do affect us the same way as what we see and what we hear. So a lot of people, the smell of what they use in dentist surgeries often can trigger them, because it reminds them of the pain. Right. A friend of mine was abused inappropriately by a relative of hers in the garden shed. To this day, when she smells creosote or wood preservative, she goes into panic. So whatever sense it is, obviously what you see when you've seen the Hyundai badge, but what you smell, what you hear, the sounds you refer to. So all of our senses become part of our alarm system. The motive of the brain, of course, is to stop us being harmed. It's to save our lives. But of course, 99.99% of the times your alarm is going off now, it is a false alarm. But you haven't got the key to turn off that alarm. You haven't. It's there. And that's what we want to talk about, because I'm intrigued to know what's happened to you since. But for most people struggling with anxiety, with triggers that have gone off, it's all because they have no switch off for that alarm. Whenever any of the senses find something similar to what happened in some traumatic experience, even if you don't call it trauma, any experience where the brain couldn't work out the outcome, couldn't predict the outcome, that is trauma. We often don't call them traumas. But whenever the brain senses any similarity, any one of our senses paralleling what was happening at the time, that is enough to set off our alarm or false alarm in nearly every case.
One thing I find it strange, because I had to go back to Westminster very often. Lots of the work I did was in Parliament. Right. So I would still have to go to Westminster Station. I would still have to go. And I felt that was good at a point where it was awful, but I felt like I was proving to myself I could do it, but it didn't take away.
Exactly.
It proved that I'm not going to die every time I cross
being
a bridge.
brave and facing it actually doesn't take away the trigger.
And I think I thought it would. Yeah. And it made it, it took me a long time, and still now.
Now, I don't know whether you tried various interventions, various therapies to deal with this, but many therapies address your thinking brain. Yeah. So, what you do when you're facing, I'm going back to Westminster, I'm going to face it, and it doesn't deal with it. The problem is actually not in your thinking brain. Your problem is in the unconscious mind. So any therapy that only addresses your thinking brain, giving you coping strategies, they're useful, they're not going to solve it because the problem is somewhere else. It's sort of like opening the boot of your car to put more oil in. No, that's the wrong part of the car. And the same is true of the therapies you need to undo the triggers that have created these false alarms.
And I think that's where, obviously, I met you at that event, which I think, like I said, it definitely changed my life, because I've never seen a queue of people. I've been to quite a lot of events. You get to the end, you normally say, anyone like to hang around for questions? And there was. Because there was something of what you said resonated with everybody, whether it was a learning problem with their children, a trauma of their own, anxiety, and I remember thinking, okay, I need to.
You're not alone.
I'm not alone. This is something. I kind of always thought I was unique. It takes something as spectacular as a terror attack to break you. And actually, I realized in that moment, half the people in that room had something that needed fixing, and they were lost because they couldn't find a way.
And in that room, that was full of high-performing people.
Yeah,
they were people who were successful. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been in that room. So our ability to mask and pretend that something isn't happening when it is, the ability to be like a duck and waddling like mad underneath, but calmly going through the water on the surface, we've all got that. But you chose in that talk, you chose to say, okay, I'm going to address this. Had you actually tried anything before, Rob?
No, bar, I was in a very small group with the people I was with at the Bridge on the Day, and we'd meet and we'd talk about it. But I mean, that's probably maybe doing more harm than good.
Yeah, but no, because you're repeating it. You're opening up the wounds.
Just talking about it would help, but actually, and there's not really anyone you could properly talk about. And I suffered with huge guilt. Was one of my biggest things, because people died on that bridge
and
that
you
day,
survived.
and I survived, and I suffered huge feelings of guilt that I felt talking about it. I felt guilty talking about it because I'm still here to talk about it.
Yeah.
So there was it was always a vicious sort of circle.
Guilt is very often associated with all sorts of traumas. So people who've been abused or raped, or that often they have an element of guilt, which they absolutely shouldn't, but it's the way the brain works. But they kind of think, did I bring it on? Did I do something that encouraged it? Could I have behaved different? So that guilt is often deeply associated with the consequences of trauma.
And it was, I'll talk about some of the treatment that I've had and how it's changed me. But by unpicking it all, it's actually more of a feeling of regret. And the regret's very different. I regret I couldn't have done anything about it.
Sure.
But I'm allowed to have a regret that I couldn't do anything. But it's not a guilt. So the two are very different. I couldn't have done anything in that moment any differently. So you can't feel guilt. You can only feel regret that you weren't able to.
So in that talk, I think and thank you for telling me what I had to speak about in that talk, because I was really in the dark. But and you kindly helped me out during the talk because you shared your experience. I don't know how painful that was. I being cruel asking you to share that? That wasn't my motive.
No, it wasn't cruel. I think sometimes it's good for me to stand up and say it, because I know I'm still around to say it. It helps sometimes. But
when I started to share the hope that there is, neuroscience has brought incredible hope about how to deal with the root cause of these things. There's two ways of dealing with trauma. One is you have a coping strategy, which is fine. It's better than nothing. But the other way, which I like, which I've been researching for many years now, is how to find and address the root cause. And because it's a completely new concept, many people don't believe it. They kind of find it hard to accept that actually there is something fundamental you can do that presses the reset button on the creation of these triggers. And it actually puts your mind back. So we'll come on to that. But when I was delivering that concept, as I'm hoping we will during this talk, and start to unscramble what is now possible that gives huge hope to the myriads of people that are struggling like you were, what was your reaction? Did it sound too good to be true, or did I was actually standing alongside you, so did it feel as if there might be some hope?
I think if I was being honest, I would have been slightly skeptical. That it did sound too good to be true.
Yeah.
But I think when you're living with something that's holding you back, your hope, that you've always got to hope that there's something. Yeah. And I think I was a bit dismissive of maybe sort of therapy, and is it the right thing for me? I'm not really sure. But there was something about, I think with me it was I think people would really, haven't heard it before, but it was the authenticity of your based on your why.
Yeah.
That's I only really engage with people who have a authentic reason for doing it. Because, there's always a feeling you might be being sold to.
Yeah,
but when you told the story about your daughter and why you did what you did, and I think, I'm sure anyone who's listening would probably like to hear it again. But that's when you had the room then.
Yeah. Well, what started my research was my own daughter. I was running some very successful businesses, and I was on the surface. I was having a grand life. I'd got all the toys that any business person would love to have, and everyone thought I was just flying with running very successful businesses. But I got a daughter that was very, very unhappy, and I'd taken her to every therapist I could find. And one of the worst insults she had during those therapy sessions, and she was describing her struggles in all sorts of ways, and her emotional struggles was leading her to feel very depressed and at times suicidal. And the only advice that she was given, and it's dreadful looking back, was, you've got to learn to live with it. And of course, when finally I was a long way from home and I got the message on the phone, she's attempted to take her life. And you can imagine what I felt. I'd got 2 hours drive to get to the hospital, and there was nobody I could access to find out, how is Susie? And so on that journey, I just went over all the things I'd tried. Had I tried everything? Was there something somebody had told me about that I didn't try that might have actually stopped this depression? So I had this horrific journey. And on the way, I decided that if she was to live, I was going to change my life. I had to do something really useful. I was making a lot of money, but I wasn't making my daughter happy. And which is more important? It's the kind of phone call, the kind of situation no dad would wish, and I certainly wouldn't wish it on anyone else. And it's because I don't wish it on anyone else. That's why I'm passionate now about bringing this to everybody, because there are things you can do. Well, when I got to the hospital, my younger daughter rushed out. She'd heard I was arrived, and she told me, yes, Susie is coming around. They think they're going to save her. My life had been changed by that point. And so it took me a while to sell my other businesses and so on, to start my research. I didn't know where to start. I hadn't got a clue where to start. But the universe made sure that I was introduced to the right academics, the professors who were coming up with amazing stuff. So that's what changed my journey, Rob. And so that's my motive now. So when I'm trying to describe to people what is possible, all I'm doing is sharing the work of the amazing neuroscientists around the world who, they might not be good at doing jigsaws, but they're brilliant at making jigsaw pieces. And I went around the world finding out that different things were identifying where the problem lies in the brain. Other research was identifying what you can do without relying on medication to make differences to those problems within the brain. And all I had to do was the jigsaw. And that's what I did. I invested in a load of clinics. I funded a load of clinics and did research on literally thousands of people. But my motive to this day is I still keep coming across amazing people like you, Rob, and thousands of others who have not heard of this. So they assume the only possible solution they've got is therapy to help them cope. And I'm not knocking that, is really valuable for many people, or medication, which effectively helps them cope, but doesn't take away the root cause of the problem. So my mission now is to get across the concept to people like you and thousands of others. That's my motive. My job isn't anything like done yet, but I appreciate you coming on this to talk about what happened to you, because your story is amazing. So after that talk where we met and you listened and you were a bit cynical, what else was going on in your mind as you led up to deciding, do you know what, I'm going to give this a go?
I think I thought things like this would be hugely expensive. And, and I thought, well,
it could be, perhaps it should be.
Well, yeah, maybe.
We don't want it to be to reach lots of people.
Well, that was my point. I thought, I know with therapy, you're hundreds of pounds an hour, and you take time out. How would I fit it in? I was already running a business. I had a busy family. How would I fit all of this in? Maybe I just need to cope a little longer. And then when you explained, actually, 10 minutes of exercise twice a day, which the exercise, how does that fit in? But fine, that didn't make much sense. But okay, I know, instantly trusted you, and then if that's all I needed in my day to be able to potentially solve this, then there's no excuse. At the time, I was reading a book called The Miracle Morning, which is all about starting your day the right way, and I was doing some form of exercise in the morning anyway. So I can fit this in. Then obviously I started to sit up with the Ceramine program. Before you know it, I was balancing on one leg and hopping. And I couldn't at the time understand how this would help. But then obviously, you know, speaking with yourself, obviously this is, you know, creating the space for my brain to then heal itself. Yeah. And my children thought it was hysterical because mummy's doing, you know, HIIT workouts. Yeah. Daddy's balancing on one leg. They thought they just thought I was lazy, and I'd be sitting there doing my, you know, following my finger around. They would sit around them almost mocking me, but that was fine because they thought, how is this? They will one day know about. They don't know about what happened to me or why. They may have found out one day. Not that I would have hidden it from them. It's just not a topic you talk about at bedtime with the kids. But even my wife, she didn't understand how it was working. And at that time, neither did I, but I trusted in the process because there are so many people you have helped. Yeah. You know, and then when I had a session with one of the therapists, so I remember I called you straight up, and we then did the EMDR sessions. Yeah, yeah. And it took me to places I didn't expect. Yeah. And actually and every time we did it, I think we did it we kept going. It was meant to be, I think it was meant to be an hour. We were actually on for an hour and 45 minutes. We were on for a long time because we said, we're making progress. Let's keep going. Yeah, and every time that we would go through the process, we started off at Westminster, which I thought was the root sort of cause. And you said that was a massive part of it. We went back further to the loss of my sister. And actually, I remember, I don't mind telling anybody this in the session, I realized I had this sort of slight, trauma is probably the wrong word, but I was never as close to my older sister who tragically died as I thought I could have been. And the only time I ever told her I loved her was straight after Westminster, because you react differently. You phone up your family, you say these things, and that was clearly. So there was the loss of her, but actually Westminster, and that was all combined. Then it went back in further to, you know, when my dad left when I was 15, I felt abandoned. You know, it goes back and back and back and back, and I thought it was just one thing. But one thing just heightens the next. Sure. But by the time I'd finished and I'd unpicked this all, and I then had there was a piece of the therapy where I was imagining water flowing through the top of my head all the way through to the bottom of my feet, sort of just healing me. It sounds like nonsense, doesn't it? But you mentioned it. And I thought, I'm going to go with it. The lady was lovely. I can't remember the lady's name. Irish lady. The Irish lady.
Oh, yes.
She was
Mairead.
I felt instantly, instantly I felt safe with her. Yeah. And then when I finished, I just felt like my brain had just had so much more space. Yeah. And I think I called you instantly afterwards to say thank you.
Well, you've just touched on a very important point. The concept that people don't get is about what available mental capacity do we have. If things have happened to us and we have very small amounts of mental capacity, we just don't have enough mental space, brain space, to be on top of what's happening in life. We get overwhelmed and overrun. This whole process is about increasing mental capacity. So if we think about our physical health, we understand the concept. Do correct exercises, eat properly, get stronger. That kind of is totally accepted as a concept. When it comes to our mental health, we have this unconscious belief that we are given a certain amount of intelligence, mental space, and that's what we have to live with. If anything happens to reduce that, we've either got to take medication or we've got to go to therapy to get it at best back to where we started. There is no concept of increasing our mental capacity, and yet the neuroscience exists. We now know how to create neuroplasticity. Magical word. Many people have heard of it. It's all about putting the brain in the right state where you can create more connections, more synapses. And the more connections we have, the bigger the brain. The more connections we have, the more powerful, the more intelligent we are. Now, these are concepts that people don't think about. We're so locked, we'd almost say brainwashed, into believing that it's only medication or classical therapy that can help you cope and get you back to it. No. You can create a bigger brain. You can create more mental capacity. And what you have to do is do the things necessary to encourage the brain to grow more and do the things that are effective at reducing what's happened in your brain to reduce your mental capacity. So it's a two-pronged attack. So you, for instance, you did those exercises, and
what were those exercises doing?
Good question. Well, when you were standing on one leg or doing this with your eyes, you were actually you're developing the very part of your brain that coordinates everything in your brain. So we were actually focusing on balance, and the reason for that is our balance organ, our vestibular system here, when that is highly exercised, when it's giving off lots and lots of signals, that's when the brain gets alert. Oh, there's something going to happen here. And so it helps create neuroplasticity in the brain. It's readying the brain for something exciting. And then we're making you do something that you don't normally do.
So if I like recite foods beginning with B, I think, was something. One of the things. Yes, while I'm doing it, is that just testing my brain almost?
Well, what we're doing a combination of things, and those exercises look quite simple. We make them as simple as possible, but they're actually developing the very bits of the brain that coordinate everything.
Right.
Obviously, one of the things they coordinate is our balance and movement. That's one thing. But when we improve those circuits, we actually improve the fundamental circuits in the part of the brain called the cerebellum that coordinates everything in the brain. So it's creating neuroplasticity, it's driving new connections, and the very new connections it's driving are the ones that helps us deal with all types of automaticity. So we're using social skills now. What's interesting for Rob, what's interesting for the listeners, those are social skills. We're not actually thinking those social skills. They're happening in the subconscious.
Okay.
When we walk, we don't think about what we do with our muscles. When we pick up a cup, we don't think about our muscles. When we're playing sport, we're at our best when we're not thinking. So the brain develops thousands and thousands of all sorts of skills, both mental and physical, that helps life become automatic and effortless. When we don't have to think, life is easy. When we still have to think, life is hard. So the cerebellum, that's the bit of the brain at the back, that's the link between brain and body. That is our master junction box. For many years, until quite recently, people thought, and often doctors today, some of them were trained to think the cerebellum is just about balance and coordination. No, it's far more important than that. It's only 10% of the volume of the brain, but it's got 75%, 3/4 of all of our brain cells. Wow. It's incredibly important. It's the bit of the brain that creates connections between different parts of the brain. It's the bit that creates different connections between parts of the brain and everything in our body. It's incredibly important. The more, the better those connections, the better life is, the more mental capacity we have. A university came to me and said, we're going to test what you're doing with older people that are in decline. I was saying, okay, hang on, steady on. We've got it kind of sussed for people right through their life, but not as far as... They said, look, don't worry, we're going to do it. And so I was on tenterhooks for weeks and weeks during this whole process. And they came to me one day, oh yeah, it works.